Okay. Hi.
Hello, hello, Molly Carmel.
I know we're meeting for the first time, but I'm like such a fangirl.
I'm a fan as well. I've been looking forward to this and chatting with you, and I'm really proud of the work you're doing and the
Ah,
contributions you're making in our
samesies.
field.
Samesies, but quick story. I need to talk I was just thinking about the story because it reminded me that I probably needed to talk to my therapist about this, which I want to get into today. I have so many things I need to talk to you about. I'm so glad to see you. So for years, people have said to me, you really need to know David Wiss. You need to know David. And I'm like, and this is the defiance in me. I'm like, don't you tell me don't you tell me who I need to know. So then I like start following you. We're in this like professionals group. And then I'm turned fangirl. And then I'm like so honored that you're going to come on What You're Craving. So safe to say, people are
Thank
usually
you.
right.
I
It's
had
just
a
like,
couple people drop your name to me over the years, and it was inevitable that we would cross paths and become allies.
yeah, we're buds. So, okay. So now that who are you? Give us like a quick 3-second or 3-minute version of like who you are, what you're all about and how you got here. Cause we have some like healing for the audience to do. Today is more of a why you're craving episode. We'll probably get to what you're craving because I think we both have the same kind of personal beliefs in life, which I can't wait to talk about. I also want to say up front, this may be more than a 1-part series, but let's stay in the moment, friend. Let's stay in the moment.
This intention for healing work is important. I am with you there. That is the energy for today.
Believe it, friend.
Yeah.
Believe it.
So,
I need some healing today. So maybe we can just have a session. No, I'm just kidding.
Let's just do that. Let's just build.
So tell us about you. You're a nutritionist.
I'm a nutritionist. My name is David Wiss, and perhaps I'll use the term wounded healer.
Word. That's why we're soulmates on it. Mm-hmm.
Let's go. I love your vulnerability, and I try to do the best that I can to be vulnerable, and maybe we'll go there today.
Yeah, it's my love language. I'm so glad to go there.
Professional. I'm a registered dietitian, and I'm the founder of Nutrition and Recovery. And we are a group practice in Los Angeles, focusing on bridging the gap between physical and mental health. So the original practice emerged to bring nutrition services to addiction treatment centers and to really bridge the gap between eating disorders and substance use disorders. And I am also an academic. So 5 years ago.
Sure are. Yeah. Wait, can you brag for a second? Like how many things that you have written so much? This is where I really swoon over you because I don't have that in me. I just write books that, like I write, like I talk. You are just like, you're a serious academic. So just brag for a minute.
I can brag. I have 18 peer-reviewed papers. That includes a couple book chapters. And I've been able to contribute as a first author to many manuscripts related to binge eating, food addiction, dietary restraint, mental health, organizational change, nutrition. So it's been great bridging the gap between clinical practice and academia. I think it's a much needed area for integration. I get to spend time with people one-on-one, and I get to learn about N of ones. And then I get to look at large data sets and learn about N's of 30,000. Yeah. And I can see where the data start to tell the same story and look for convergence.
So I always have this commitment to, I'm just going to pause for a second. Do you have earbuds that can link into your computer?
The answer is yes. Does it not sound good? Because I've had very good feedback on the non-earbud approach.
The only thing it sounds is a little, I don't know what the adjective I want to use is. It just is a little, it's the room actually. It just,
okay. Let me see what I have. I do have earbuds.
I think sometimes, that's why I have this like, Michael Jackson microphone here. So it's just to soften it. I just think you have such important things to say. I don't think that. I know you have such important things to say.
My experience with the earbuds in the past has been that I feel so constrained.
Yeah.
Because I think I would have like high tech cordless ones.
Well, they were given to me by my podcast company. In fairness, I didn't buy these on my own. But now I actually don't know what I would do without it. My little Shure microphone. The other thing, Dave, is like, I just try to be really mindful on this podcast. Dear Media asks me that we sort of dumb it, like we keep it sort of as like non-clinical as possible, which I think you're actually incredibly good at.
Yeah.
But I've had people, I mean, there's been people I've had on the podcast where I actually wasn't able to even publish their material because it was too like sciencey, not consumable.
Consumer friendly.
Yeah.
I'm going to be really unhappy about these, but I'm going to do it.
It's like, we're just going to tolerate the distress of the moment.
Because there's no video, right?
Yeah, there'll be a little bit of video, but about 1 minute just on my social. That's all that there is.
Well, I'll do better in the future and buy one of these fancy $500 ear things.
Well, you should have a podcast. So that would make a lot of sense that you would have one of these.
Well, I'm at home. I'm not in my office.
Yeah. Let's see how it sounds.
Testing 1, 2.
So much better.
One time I did a podcast and I used these and it brushed up against my zipper.
Yeah.
And the whole podcast had this background noise and I couldn't even listen to it. And I didn't share it with my audience.
But Dear Media is like actually really clear about us wanting people to have have earbuds on whenever they can. So
I had a negative experience with the earbuds.
I hear you. We can do some trauma work around it, you know?
Do it. Let's heal.
So, I mean, it's amazing. You have, and I have to say, I want to make sure this isn't just a podcast of us like just agreeing with everything each other says, but it might just be, I think you bring to this field from a nutritionist standpoint, something so different. And I am endlessly grateful for you. Let's talk a little bit about it. I have a bunch of questions, but you're one of these few nutritionists that believe in food addiction. And like me, you're one of these few people who believes in food addiction, but also believes that not everybody is a food addict. That's to me the problem in our industry. If you're a food addiction person, you're like, everyone's a food addict and you can't do, and the same prescription goes, or you're like, you should moderate everything. And you're one of these people who I'm just like, eye opened, doe-eyed about, which is like, hey, well, you say what you feel. I'm not putting words in. You tell us everything we need to know. If you're sitting here struggling, like, I don't know what to do with my life and I can't stop eating this food and I don't know what to do and I'm in diet drama and trauma, I feel like you have some solutions for us. Like, take me there. We're just going right into it.
Let's go right into it. I've seen the extremes formulate over the years and I was baffled by it. And I had developed certain thoughts about, gray areas. And I felt like no one was thinking the way I was thinking, or at least willing to talk about areas of intersection, areas where, food addiction science converges with classical eating disorder science. Mm-hmm. And I was one of the first people in my mind, at least, to speak out. And then in recent years, I meet you and I meet other people that are speaking out about how this, area of food addiction has way more nuance than people seem to believe. And so,
well, I would say that people want to believe. I mean, I think it's everybody's great quest to have there be. So, I mean, I don't know for you too. I mean, someone's like, just tell me what to eat. And I'm like, don't work that way with the food. If I do tell you what to eat, I can promise you're not going to eat that. Mm-hmm. But when you talk about the polarization, can you just explain that more to someone who's like, I don't even know what you guys are talking about? We want to bring everyone into our lunch date,
Yeah, let's do a little historical recap. The world of eating disorders, at least in the treatment sense, got very much, popularized. Maybe that's not a good word. The treatment models became very focused on the treatment of individuals with anorexia nervosa because they have very restrictive tendencies. And the nutrition treatment was very clear, is that we had to eliminate people's cognitive bias against quote unquote bad foods. And
what's cognitive bias, David?
Yeah, thank you. There's one of the best parts about being an academic is learning about bias, learning about how a statistical method could skew information in a way that tells a slightly different story, and a lot of it's hidden, right? So there's a lot of sources of bias in our world, and each individual has sources of bias in our mind. So if we come into a situation with prior experience, we're going to invariably be colored by our prior experience, right? That is the experience of being human. It's impossible to avoid that. We're all biased, right? And I have.
So what would an example of that be? Like, even from an eating disorder perspective, what would an example of that be?
Yeah, so someone that has a dysfunctional relationship with food might have learned from someone, perhaps a mother or a trainer or someone along the way, that there was a rule like you couldn't eat past 6 o'clock.
Right.
And that if you were eating past 6 o'clock, you were doing something that was harmful to your metabolic health and you were going to gain weight, etc. And so it could set up, it could start off as an idea, and then it could become a rule for someone. And then it could become an extreme, right? Where there's a cognitive distortion, which suggests that if someone were to eat at 6:20, they were a bad person. But if they ate at 5:40, they were doing great, right?
I mean, are you just telling my story? I wish I was kidding. Okay, next. Great. So what we were seeing in traditional eating disorder is the treatment of mostly anorexia was the treatment for everybody.
The treatment was mostly for anorexia and bulimia nervosa because those were the two recognized eating disorders. So a lot of the original research on eating disorders came before binge eating disorder was an actual diagnosis, right? It came in the DSM-5 in 2013. It was in prior renditions of the DSM for the sake of research.
And for those people listening, what's the DSM?
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It is the Bible of mental health, as some people call it, what psychiatrists and other medical professionals use for diagnostic coding.
Yeah. And I think what you're about to say about binge eating for people listening, because I think largely the people who hang out with me are binge eaters and other eating disorders. But what's the fun fact about binge eating disorder in these manuals?
You tell me. Tell me something fun.
I mean, up until 2018, it was hard. It was not that it wasn't hard. It was hardly diagnosable, and certainly not in a way that would be covered by insurance, which is still today very hard to impossible to have binge eating disorder covered by insurance, and just a total mess for the masses of people who are struggling to really be able to get access to solid help.
Yeah, I think there's a long way to go with binge eating disorder treatment, and part of my vision for the future and my personal career is to be able to create nuanced binge eating disorder treatment where people could really get targeted care based on who they are, not what their diagnosis is.
I agree. I have such a hard, because I think, especially with binge eating disorder, the amount of times in my career that somebody said, what is binge eating disorder? What is binge eating? Like, how would you answer that question? How do I know if I have a binge eating disorder?
Yeah, thank you. And one of the reasons why
you're welcome. Why are you thanking me?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the intelligent questions.
Well, I'll keep them coming, friend.
Keep them coming. I know that there's a lot of overlap between binge eating disorder, quote unquote obesity, and food addiction, right? So the intersection.
This is the only question that we want to answer today, and we're going to get to so many more. So let's like roll this out. Let's roll this out. So there's obesity, and can we just say what that is? Binge eating, can we say what that is? And then food addiction, we say what that is. And like, here are my 100 other questions. Like, how do I know what I have? And then what do I do with what I have from a nutritionist standpoint?
Yeah, obesity is probably the easiest to define because it's a quantitative assignment based on BMI, body mass index, which is a relationship between an individual's height and weight. So most systems classify obesity as having a BMI above 30, right? So that is a very medicalized approach. And I think a lot of people might assume that if someone has obesity, that they're binge eating or that they have a food addiction. And this has not been shown to be the case, right? There's a lot of ways that an individual can manifest living in a larger body without ever binge eating or without ever having a food addiction. Binge eating is a mental health diagnosis, right? And that's an important distinction. It's a mental health diagnosis because it affects someone's quality of life, right? You're seeing significant impairment and distress based on episodes of eating behavior where there is usually a subjectively large amount of food consumed. And this is where it gets really tricky because a lot of people, especially dieters, can experience what they feel to be a binge, and someone else would look at that and that said, that's an evening snack. That's not a binge, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it requires someone else to sort of evaluate what is actually going on with a person, right? So binge eating disorder is probably the least clear of them all. Maybe food addiction is right there with it, but because it's a mental health diagnosis, a lot of people don't emphasize, the criteria of binge eating disorder, which focuses on, restraint, shame. A lot of the consequences of binge eating disorder go beyond just the physical domain, such as accumulating excess weight.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point about binge eating disorder. I mean, I love the idea that, it's in the psychological and spiritual realm. And I read a book many years ago that cited, I'm not sure it was as sciencey as you would say, but cited that 80% of people can fit the criteria, at least with that old diagnostic manual. So let's talk food addiction for a second. Okay. What's that?
Yeah, I think that there's probably a need for some nuance here. Food addiction is using criteria for substance use disorder. So we're looking at the 11 criteria for a substance use disorder, things like loss of control, continued use despite negative consequences. Some of the more controversial ones include the experience of withdrawal or developing tolerance. So
David, why are those controversial though?
Yeah.
Withdrawal and consequences.
Though consequences are not controversial. The concept of tolerance and withdrawal, I think, where there was the most sort of pushback from certain scientific communities, because those were things that you could easily see with drug addiction, right? Individuals that use opioids and methamphetamine clearly need more and more as time goes on. And when they stop using, they have clear symptoms of withdrawal that can be measured, right? And then, when you compare food to hardcore drugs, a lot of people said, well, there's no tolerance and there's no withdrawal, therefore it can't be a food addiction. And that was one of the first real major arguments against the food addiction construct, is that those things can't exist with food. And I think a lot of people listening say, well, I've experienced tolerance. I needed more than I needed previously.
I'm literally sitting here being like, well, if you gave me one cookie, I would be like, I don't even want it. I don't even want it. It's just not even remotely.
You need more in order to be satisfied.
I need more just thinking about it. Forget it even going in my mouth.
Yeah. You know what your threshold is, right?
Yeah. It's empty. It's endless. It's infinite.
I understand.
Thank you. It's so validating.
Yeah. And I relate.
Yeah. Wait, can we pause for a second?
Sure.
Your niche in this industry is so interesting. It's really hard to find a nutritionist who will even be willing to have a conversation like this. I need to put this out there to people. I mean, I know 4. I know 4 nutritionists in my life. 6, that's a lie. 6 nutritionists that will even talk like this. How'd you get here?
Great question. In terms of my own personal journey.
Yeah.
Yeah. I ended up getting sober in 2006 after really having some lows personally, and started my life over. And I wasn't ever interested in nutrition until I got sober. I found that using plants and sunlight and water and exercise created a real revolution in my body, and my depressive and anxiety symptoms started to reduce. And I became thoroughly convinced that nutrition was important for me. I knew that it was important for me.
So you got sober from drugs and alcohol.
Correct.
In 2006.
Correct.
And then when that happened, you were like, oh my God, there's a whole different way that I'm living that really, really works for me, which is not being hungover and high all the time. Cheers to that, by the way. I'm with you.
Right on.
I believe you me. It's like going from black and white to seeing color. Yeah.
Yeah. And my experience with nutrition was I probably got into it for vanity reasons. I wanted to get in shape. I wanted to quote unquote look good, but I quickly realized that there was a profound mental health impact that food and other wellness behaviors had on me. And so I became very interested in learning more about the intersection between nutrition and mental health. And I worked as a trainer for a few years. I ended up going to graduate school. And when I went to get a master's degree and become a registered dietitian, I did understand more where a lot of the information comes from in terms of the training for RDs. And I saw that my field and my parent organization was highly influenced by food companies and big industry,
Oh
right?
my God, I just got the chills. This is the first I've ever heard of this. So the nutrition education program is influenced by food companies?
Yes. The
How's
Academy
that?
of Nutrition and Dietetics is the parent organization for dietitians. And when I became a dietetic intern, we formed a group called the Dietitians for Professional Integrity, where we started doing some whistleblowing on conflicts of interest that existed in our field. So
shut the front door.
is,
I've been
yes,
doing this work for 20, I've never heard this before in my life. Wow.
yes. So food companies were very smart, and they were able to get a seat at the table in, these organizations that essentially work to train future nutrition professionals. I mean, it's one of the most genius things that you could ever imagine.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's like the day that, Vyvanse for binge eating disorder was okayed by the Binge Eating Disorder Association. I was like, there's some bedfellows there. That is some shady, shady
They,
stuff,
they took a pretty big donation, didn't they?
I would imagine so, because
Yes.
otherwise it's just bonkers.
Yeah. So being an early career dietitian, I'm watching webinars from Frito-Lay's teaching us about salt. I'm watching the dairy industry teaching us that dairy is the only source of calcium. I'm watching this argument. I couldn't believe it. I was a young dietitian. I was probably a dietetic intern, and I watched a webinar like in a classroom setting that basically showed evidence that high fructose corn syrup was identical to sugar, and that there was no differences in any forms of sugar when they look at it from, for example, like a blood sugar standpoint, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it was really clear that for-profit agendas were infiltrating, the dietitian curriculum, and that they were training people to work in the Western medicine model, right? To work in a hospital, right? That's the kind of main career trajectory for dietitians. As you become a clinical dietitian, you work in a hospital where they have a food service operation. And a lot of what's going on in the hospital has to do with medical interventions like surgeries and medications, right? And so it was really clear to me that there was a public health crisis. There was an intersection between, big food and big pharma, and that they were intelligent enough to know that if you can insert your people at these conferences where dietitians need to go for continuing professional education units, that they'll believe, right, what's being presented. Because, and I hope dietitians aren't upset when I say this, but dietitians.
Oh, I'm all about disrupting dietitians. Make them upset. Don't splice words here. Come on, we're saving lives. Let's go.
Let's go. Yeah, I have a master's in nutrition and became a registered dietitian prior to, getting into the PhD program. But the training doesn't really involve being able to critically evaluate research on your own. It very much is about getting information from someone who got it from somewhere else, right? So the parent organization is sort of clear that we're going to synthesize information for you. We're going to look at the evidence and give you the guidelines, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so dietitians aren't trained to be independent thinkers. Dietitians in essence from the training comes from home economics, right? It's a very marginalized field. It's a field that is traditionally over 90% women. There seems to be a gender bias, where it is, I feel like it's an oppressed community.
Wow.
And yeah, the training that I received was very much, don't question what you learn. Don't stand up for what you believe in. We have a lane for you. And we
So
want you
how
to
did you come from that and then figure out this part about food addiction, which, both of us are harm reduction, food addiction people, which we need to make sure that we get to in this conversation about like, what do I do if I'm food addicted and what does that mean? But like, how did you take that leap over to food addiction?
Yeah. So I mean, they're perfectly correlated, right? If you think about it, the food companies have these incredible resources, and they have laboratories where they do food science research, and they figure out.
We had Michael Moss on the show.
Right.
That book, that if you want the quickest and most accurate version of what David is talking about right now, go pick up Michael Moss's Hooked. It is, if you're not convinced that food is addictive after reading Hooked, then, I don't know. I want to be as brainwashed as you or something. I'm not quite sure.
The first book was Salt, Sugar, Fat.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was incredible. And it described how food companies were leveraging technology to maximize their profit. Right.
Sure.
And so I'm learning about how food companies are co-opting research and influencing narratives and getting their message across. And I'm seeing the message that's getting across, which is there are no bad foods. Eat everything in moderation, and it's the total diet that matters. And you cannot point the finger at any particular food or even a constituent of food. You just have to think about the combination of nutrition and exercise, and get people to count their calories. Right?
So crazy. None of that works, and
that's
all you're getting taught.
That's what dietitians are getting taught, right? Energy balance from calories in, calories out. I think that there's a little bit of progression that's happened. I take on dietetic interns and I talk to people on the cutting edge, but there's definitely an old guard in the registered dietitian world.
Well, and I think, listen, I think that is what contributes to diet drama and trauma. I mean, the amount I treat so many people that are just screaming at me that they need to lessen their calories. And I'm like, so like, what are we living in 1972? Like the data is just like, so there's so much to talk about. So obviously you're finding like food is addictive, and then you go study it. Like, what have you found in your research that's most exciting and mind-blowing to you about people who are food addicted, treatment of food addiction? Like, what does everybody listening like need to know that's going to groundbreak them, make them clearer on who they are, what they need to be doing in their relationship with food? Like, break the ground for me.
Yeah, and I'll circle back to one of our previous points. We were talking about the distinction between binge eating disorder and food addiction.
I know, so many things to talk about.
Someone with binge eating disorder might get started on a pint of ice cream, and they're very likely to finish it off, right? Because they experience a binge, right? Whereas someone with food addiction might be able to only eat half of it, but you better be sure, I said might, you better be sure that they're going to want to eat it the next night. So the brain, the reward systems in the brain work with memory to assign value to certain things. And in science, we call it salience. And I don't want to get too off into.
Yeah, because also I'm not that smart when it comes to this. So you're going to lose me for sure. And then it won't be such a fun lunch date, you know.
There's a part of the brain that, so there's a lot of confusion about dopamine. People used to think dopamine was just about feeling good. And then we've learned more so that dopamine is about learning, right? It's about motivation and the assignment of value to certain things. So if someone has life stressors, underlying trauma, there's been a whole lifetime legacy of comfort eating, or what some people call emotional eating, the brain is truly going to learn that the neurochemical response from food is alleviating, right?
Oh, so what we're saying is that, so for me, like it started at 7, and at 7, it was like, actually it's lies, 4. When when I found out my dad died, it's like, I was just hoarding, and I was just hoarding food since then. So Sugar and I were like in deep relationship from 4. So what you're saying is from the age of 4, like my emotional eating messed with my dopamine receptors. Yeah.
Correct. The link in your brain was made between the ingestion of the substance and the reduction of the negative affect or the low emotional states, right?
So basically like Freihofer's cookies make me feel better since the age of 4. I could see a Freihofer cookie now and I'd be like, that would make me feel better. It wouldn't long term, but short term. I mean, I have such and Michael Moss writes about that so much in that book that like we're screwed because at 4, I started to make that correlation. Like we're both in recovery from substance. Like that wasn't at 4, right? That wasn't like when my brain was that viable. It was later on, but you know what I mean?
Yeah. I heard a researcher once describe addictions as learning disorders, and that the brain is essentially over learning something. You've had an experience that's extremely rewarding, and then the brain learns that that does something that's positive for another part of the brain, and it starts to assign it value, and it starts to remember that that does something important that seems to promote survival. So in the face of negative consequences, once someone is eating food and not feeling great about it, there's a more evolved part of our brain, that prefrontal cortex regions, cortical regions, that are saying, you know, this is rationally not in your best interest. I don't think that you should continue this behavior because it doesn't match your long-term goals. And then you have another part of your brain that's more reptilian, right? Less cognitive and more survival based, that just knows basic functionings. And with food addiction, this is how I like to understand it. That part of the brain starts to dictate and really starts to run the show, and it overrides one's capacity for using reason and just basic willpower and judgment to navigate the food supply. So with all addictions, some people have described it as a hijacking of the brain. What we see is that food, and I don't think that calling it similar to heroin and cocaine is that useful, because
well, me too. And I also think people who say that have never done cocaine, another story for another time.
I do know that I've met people that have.
I'm like a hardcore sugar addict. I mean, I have like thrown up, eaten it again, like, and still that, I think that's the complicated part of food addiction, to be honest, is that yes, you get that high, but the death is so slow and the consequence is so slow that to me, that's a big part of it. Like cocaine, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is addictive. Like that, you start it, you do it, you're like, want more. And sugar, I think it's so complicated because everyone's telling you it's okay and it's normal and it's at your birthday party, and that there maybe is something wrong with you if you can't moderate it. Like it's so complicated in that way, but I am so with you on this point. I think it worsens our case, that like study, which I'm not even sure is true, that says it's 8 times as addictive as cocaine. Every time someone said that to me in a podcast, I've said, well, I don't know if you've ever done cocaine before.
So I've always posed the argument that it's much more like caffeine or nicotine.
Yeah.
It's real subtle, and that a lot of people can experience addiction without even knowing it, right? So it's like the classic case of the person who drinks coffee every single day and then has a second one in the afternoon. And if they don't get it, there's problems, right? Headaches or other negative processes. You could talk to that individual and talk to them about coffee, and they might admit that they're addicted, but you could see their brain step in with some of these biased ways of thinking. They might say something like, you know, I really just love the taste. Mm-hmm. And someone like me listens, I'm like, okay, the taste of coffee is great.
I'm a pretty end stage food addict. So like, I actually think I'm some kind of hybrid of a cocaine addict meets a caffeine addict when it comes to my food. Cause like, I would really go, like, I would like leave this interview to go get food back in the day. I'd be like, this is great. I'd like end it early. You know what I mean? I'd be like, great to talk to you. I need to go get my food. I mean, I think that's sort of the problem with food addiction, different than, I mean, I've been in addiction service a long time. Like it's so different, like an alcohol addiction. And I guess in this world now, it's becoming even more nuanced, right? There's just more sober, curious. Abstinence isn't the only way. To me, I actually think in food addiction, the idea that it hasn't been more varied until, you know, you and I and some other people came in the field to say abstinence can't be the only way because you're eating, is pretty crazy in some ways. Wouldn't you say?
Yes, indeed. And I think one of the really important distinctions in the food addiction conversation is the distinction between looking at it as an individual level problem, and then you end up comparing, okay, end stage food addict versus more subtle, manageable type of food addict, and then looking at it as a public health problem. So when it's looked at as a public health problem, you start to see that there's subtle forms of addiction that might not be highly clinically relevant, that would get someone to quote unquote seek treatment. But those are still important forms of food addiction that have an impact on, the health of the planet. And that's when the food company conversation comes back into the picture.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious, like, do you not believe in end stage food addiction? Is that what you're saying? Because
No, I
okay.
think that the focus on extremes detracts from the main point that we
So
want
you're
to get.
saying if you're not an end stage food addict, you may still have a problem that needs some treatment.
Correct. It's the equivalent of someone that goes to a 12-step meeting for their alcohol and all they hear is about people shooting heroin and going to
Right.
prison. And they're sort of like, well, I never shot heroin. I never smoked crack. I never broke the law. Do I belong here? Right. And so I think when we look at the extremes, it makes, certain people question if they, identify with that certain construct.
Yeah, no, I think that makes, I think absolutely people are always looking to not look at the solution. I think the brain is wired that way, like rather not go into that kind of pain of giving something up if you don't have to, right? That's the brain is wired for that. Let's talk about how we heal. How do we heal?
Yeah, I think one of the areas of food addiction where I became interested, I think there was a major gap. We have people in the food addiction world doing incredible psychological research using these validated tools and figuring out what food addiction correlates with in terms of other mental health symptoms, depression, anxiety, socioeconomic status, gender. We have researchers that are doing neuroimaging that are showing these brain regions that are similar. Like there's a lot of people doing really important work on food addiction. And one area where I saw a gap that I was working on clinically with people is the intersection of food addiction and excessive dietary restraint. So
I need that way dumbed down for me.
yeah, you got it. I think that the term dietary restraint would be synonymous with restrained eating,
like restriction,
or dieting, or
okay,
restriction.
dieting. Good. So the difference between the difference between food addiction and just, this is the great question that everybody asks me on every podcast I go on in the world when they say, how is it? So I guess answer this question for me, because this is where your research really lives. How is treating food addiction from not eating sugar different than a restrictive diet? And what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that the efforts to treat food addiction from a nutrition standpoint are often, confused with people's effort to lose weight, because there are different conceptual models to think about. Okay, so one school of research says that higher BMIs and weight gain is a driver of food addiction, right? That the brain learns food as a result of metabolic dysfunction and reward dysfunction. And then the other sort of idea is that food addiction drives overeating. And so I think that when people are trying to treat food addiction, a lot of people assume that the treatment of food addiction has to come with weight loss. And so
but I have a huge question here. This is like, my back is coming up because I hear and maybe this is just a function of your area of research, but like there are a ton of people who are dying with some extra weight on them, and actually I would say that maybe not even biologically, maybe more spiritually and emotionally. And then there's just every nutritionist that they meet saying, you shouldn't want to lose weight. This whole health at any size thing, which I'm saying, this is not saying this to people who are happy in their bodies overweight. I mean, that's wonderful. But there are so many people who are deep in food addiction don't know it, want to be releasing weight, and nutritionists are like, that's not okay. Like, you need to love your body exactly as it is. And I think that's really hard.
It is. A lot of people have trauma surrounding the body that they live in. I think that if we equate people putting on weight and feeling really uncomfortable, it could be traumatizing. And one of the symptoms of trauma is avoidance. And I see a lot of people setting up their whole life to avoid that from ever happening again. And they're in crises management and, fight or flight. But let's take a nutrition example. If someone is a sugar addict and they've been eating highly palatable, sweets,
cookies, cakes, candies,
pastries, and all of that thing. And now they want to get into recovery for their food addiction, right? And so we have to start to think about, if someone is going to say, I want to move away from refined sugars, one really possible solution for someone would be to, at all their meals, make sure that there was a starch and eat fruit, at snacks for breakfast and for dessert, and make sure they're getting a good amount of carbohydrates that aren't in the form of refined sugar, in order to not set up their brain for the threat of deprivation, right?
Word.
And so someone could come in to treatment and end up on a high calorie, high carbohydrate, very well balanced diet that included a lot of fruits, and they could give their brain a chance to heal from the addiction related eating, right? And to reduce that overactive reward pathway and not lose weight. And then at some point, once their brain settles down, think about, okay, what are some of these other factors I want to think about? Versus if someone says, I want to get off sugar, and they get themselves on the protein and vegetable diet, and now they're on a low calorie diet, they're trying to do sugar addiction treatment, they're trying to do keto, and their brain is just registering
I
threats,
can't listen to one more part of this. It's like my diet trauma coming. I know. Well, it's such an interesting thing. Marty Lerner talks about this, I think, in his book, but every great binger is really a restrictor, right? I mean, because
I wouldn't say every, I would say most.
Me too. Thank you for that correction. But it's an interesting thing to see what has happened with this fear of carbs and how that is linked into food addiction somehow. I mean, it's really amazing. I mean, I also love a carb more than life, and carbs love me. I think it's a really interesting point what you're saying, which is it's not necessarily, it's this obsession with needing to release the weight on somebody else's time. You're not saying it doesn't happen, but you're saying, listen, we have to regulate these systems before we can do anything, because you're in this deep, dark cycle. And I say the same thing too. I was working, somebody actually wrote this in my Facebook group, and she said, I feel like this plan that's in my book, Breaking Up with Sugar, which is not written, that plan was not written by me. It was written by Nikki Glantz, one of the 6 nutritionists I know that believe in food addiction. And she says, I just feel like this is too much food. And I wrote in all caps on the Facebook page, this is a binge waiting to, your binge is dying to come in. This is a binge waiting to happen. Please hear what I'm saying, because that's kind of the whole cycle, right? So what you're saying is people come to me and I'm like, hey, we got to restore your system right here. People are like, I'm firing you. I would have. I'd be like, you're trying to make me fat.
Because if someone has a deep wound about the experience of living in their body, it's going to be hard to be satisfied, right? For example, if I were to say, I'll make something up. I want to make $1 million next year, right? Me wanting that can be very beneficial if I want to work really hard and develop some new ways to generate income. I'm using an example that I think most people will understand. Let's say that that desire is coming from a place in my childhood where I felt like I didn't have enough and I needed to be more, work harder, prove myself to the world. And it was driven from a deep wound. Let's say that I did end up doing that. At that point, most likely, I'm going to say, it might be great. Maybe I'll celebrate it, but then I'm going to say, all right, I want to make more money.
Right. I need 2 million. I need 3 million. I need 4 million. Yeah.
Right?
That's
so
addiction.
Body trauma, And then they have a weight loss goal, and then they lose that 20 pounds, but their body trauma is persistent. They're gonna focus on what's the next thing. How can I change this part of my body? My skin is loose, right? And so this
we just have the same life. We have the same practice. Yes.
This effort to, like, quote unquote, make peace with your body has a lot of value, especially in food addiction treatment, because someone can consider that I want to stop binge eating. I want to stop engaging in food addiction. I want to stop eating refined sugars. And I am going to focus on using nutrition to support my best mental health so that I am not susceptible to extremes. I'm not living in the highs and lows. I'm not sacrificing my morality. I'm not doing things that I said I wasn't going to do. I'm not failing to show up for my roles and responsibilities, right? But I'm going to be eating enough food to where, my body is going to be able to use the nutrients that are in food to heal my brain, right? And then at some point, I'm going to trust that some of the weight related issues are going to sort themselves out. I personally have had more success with that approach, and the reason is because when you do combine food addiction and weight loss, people run the risk of rebound binging because they get greedy with their weight loss. They're dissatisfied. They're weighing themselves every single day. And so I think,
and I want to say, I think, see, we're adding in really important part here that we're not saying, which is because if you have a propensity for eating disorder, you're actually feeding an eating disorder there, right? I mean, that's the point of what you're saying, which is, we don't know. Sometimes people are food addicted and not eating disorder. Sometimes people we didn't even bring that piece into it. And so, if the scale will just become the new addiction, which I've seen 1,000 times. And I was just talking to somebody who finally, I don't really know how she did it because it was a parenthetical. I wasn't treating her, but she said, I lost all this weight and now I hate my body. And I was like, welcome to your new addiction, right? It's like, what is enough? I have one more thing I want to talk about. I need to know. So so what you're saying is that one of your big solutions to healing food addiction, and actually it sounds like any disorder, is to really you're saying, I think how you're talking, weight release is going to be an inevitable outcome because you're just getting the systems back together. You got to heal everything up, and then you can work on releasing. Right. And I actually write about that in Breaking Up with Sugar. This one guy, I was like, he was eating 7 loaves of bread a day and for breakfast. It wasn't like, I wasn't gonna be like, hey, how about we get to half a cup of oatmeal, not an idiot. And we just reduced his food really nicely. And, he's kept off probably 150, 600, 160 pounds a couple of years now. It's amazing. I mean, what I really hear you say, like there is no one solution is what you're saying.
I've worked with a lot of people that have gotten into recovery for binge eating and for food addiction and have lost weight. And the tragedy is when people that have other physiological things going on, perhaps there's, higher BMIs in their family. They live in a larger body ever since they were a kid. They have poor sleep. They have a disrupted microbiome. They have, hormonal problems. There is a lot of other things going on. And this person desperately wants to lose weight, and they look at Molly Carmel's story. They look at these like extreme examples, and they say, well, if someone else lost 100 pounds and kept it off, why can't I? And they're so upset. And there's a difference between someone who's never really made any efforts to change their nutrition and someone that's lost 40, 50 pounds 7 times, right? If someone's like, if their body's at 240, 250 and they get down to 200 from dieting, but they always go up to 250 afterwards, there's a story there, right? And so I do think that, weight discussion and diets like, low carbohydrate, nut avoiding diets.
Avoiding. Don't get me started on nut avoiding diets.
Those are the things that are really doing a disservice to the progression of the food addiction world.
Yeah. Grape avoiding diet. There was a whole conversation about people like not wanting to eat grapes. And it's like, I don't know. And also I feel like when we start to avoid other foods, like that's an emotional problem that we're making a nutritional issue. And it's like, there's clear science on sugar and flour. It's like the rest of it just becomes, which I'd like you to define, like a little orthorexic, right? What's orthorexia?
It's an obsession with the quality of food rather than the quantity of food. So people become very interested in whether or not it's organic and where it came from. And that can become a significant source of impairment and distress.
Hmm.
And when that intersects with anorexia, it's quite brutal.
I have to be honest, when it intersects with compulsive overeating, it's quite brutal. Like,
Yes.
can we get spiritual for a second? Because this orthorexia, this obsession, like it's a full-time, I say it's 3 jobs. You're like a single working mother with 15 jobs when you really get deep into what we're talking about now. Haven't you seen, like, there's no room for joy. There's no room for hobby. There's no room for service. There's no room for hope. I mean, it's just, there's nothing to do when you get this obsessed.
Yeah, but it's also one of those things. I think orthorexia is totally debilitating, but it's also one of these things that goes back to the earlier parts of our conversation about the food industry.
Mm.
Once you learn that there are companies that are compromising private health for compromising public health for private profits, and they're doing things to food that are designed to maximize their experience and then make it more difficult for individuals to live happy, joyous, and free lives, right? You start to get a little bit angry. And so I understand why.
That's a beautiful, I love that. Yeah. So you're saying there's some validity to it, but then it takes off. So like, to me also, I think it's so important about who you choose to trust from what you're saying too. Cause I think my story is really interesting, I guess. Not really. I don't really think, but I would hate for people to think that what happened for me is exactly what should happen. And I think I see so many sales pitches of programs that are rooted entirely in, I don't know, something that, and we're not even sure it's happening. Oh, I overate for most of my life and I found the solution and you should sign up for my program. And there's no science and there's no watch where, I don't know, like, what do you think of this industry and what can I do as if I'm struggling?
It's sort of like the people that go to gyms and pick the personal trainer that has the best body, right? They sort of assume that the person who's got the best body
or the best promises
is going to pull you in toward that direction. But you could have someone that's not obsessed with their body and doesn't work out, doesn't have genes that give them 6 packs, and they could actually be a better trainer than the person that looks gorgeous by some people's definitions. So I think that we need to be careful about extrapolation, which means taking someone else's story and assuming that it's completely relevant, especially in the 12-step community when people find sponsors and then they take on their sponsors' recovery. They take on the rules of recovery that someone else has.
I wish this was only true in 12-step recovery. You know, I don't actually do a lot of that in my own life or practice. I actually see that with health coaches. I mean, honestly, if you want to take that to the dieting community, that's health coaching, right?
That's what it is. A health coach that found something that they're passionate about, that wants to extend those findings to anyone that comes their way.
And help me understand as a registered, why is that dangerous for me if I'm struggling in my relationship with food, that I just find somebody who has a good story and maybe has gone through a coaching program?
Yeah, it's dangerous because it ends up being more beneficial to the provider than for the patient. The provider saying, I have a food philosophy and this is what I teach and this is what I do. Follow me and you will get what I got. It completely bypasses the idea that there's a spectrum or a continuum of things that work for people. Each individual has their own set of genes and their microbiome and their own neurochemistry. And that the quest is to find out where someone lies on these continuums, right? In terms of food addiction, eating disorder, where someone lies on some of these other co-occurring mental health issues. And to also, this is important, once you find the message of recovery that resonates with you, whether it be through spiritual movements or through clinicians, also remember that it's a moving target, that like what you find at some point in your journey doesn't become this blueprint for the rest of your recovery. People are searching so hard to find that one perfect exercise and food plan and recovery plan. But as you navigate life and we change at the cellular level, things are going to have to evolve. So if people don't become empowered as eaters and learn how to navigate and make some of their own decisions, they're inevitably going to end up at a same dead end where they don't know what to do, and they're seeking the next guru and the next health coach to tell them what to do.
Oh, because diet culture's ruined us in that way. Every relationship I have in my life that is positive and negative, but has evolved over time. It is not the same relationship for 20 years. And how in the world could it be that way? People are so scared of that diet mentality that they're like, no, I mean, if I ever add chickpea pasta to this is my story, I could never have Ezekiel bread. And it's like, no, I can, because I've evolved over time, I love this. Thank you. This is so important. I need to ask you one more question. It's because I feel like if I was listening to this podcast, I'd be like, I need you to tell me. I mean, we're saying nobody's a guru, but also we need to help people. Can you tell me two things? If I need to figure out this problem that I have, what are 3 or 4 really tangible things I can do? And some of them, if I don't have a penny in my pocket.
Sure. Well, one thing, and this goes to our previous point, is that you want to make sure that you're not chasing the past. A lot of people have a euphoric recall of a body that they lived in, or a way that they were eating, or a thing that they were doing in the past, and have this idea that they're going to recreate something that they did, right? And it's much wiser to use our lived experiences as data that informs us as we move into the future. And people are chasing bodies of yesteryear, food plans of yesteryear, and they really lose this idea that there is something new, uncharted. There's a new chapter in your life that you can step into right now and use your past to help inform that, but not try to recreate that.
Love that. Right. So then what? How do I find it?
Yeah, I think that it's really important to, accumulate knowledge and to learn things about food and to learn things about nutrition and to learn about approaches that are out there. But then at some point, it might be wise to become abstinent from all that information. We call it a high fact diet. Someone is just like endlessly consuming the next workshop, reading the next book, hoping to, and in reality, too much information to the insecure soul can lead people astray. And I think that at some point in the journey, you can tune out all the other sources of people's experience, or even, some of the science can be jarring for people, and just focus on living in the body that you live in and being the eater that you are today, and using the data that you have in your life to inform what might be the best next.
But what if I need help? How would you? I don't think I could do that. I have to say that when I was deep in my thing, I think I couldn't tolerate being in this body, and I needed help. How would you suggest somebody find good help?
Yeah, I think that, the future of nutrition is focusing on gut health and brain health, right? And the intersection between the two. If someone is caught up in the model of calories in, calories out, if it fits in your macros, just count your macronutrient distribution, and what I like to call the MyFitnessApp approach to nutrition, right?
Yes.
That is a outdated model. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm not saying that it doesn't have scientific merit. In fact, it has plenty. But if someone is really trying to get into recovery, and you focus on eating to optimize gut health, and you focus on eating to repair reward pathways in the brain that have been abused, it's a really good starting point. And so when I say focus on eating for gut health, that might mean that a diet soda or something with an artificial sweetener that might fit really well into a calorie model would not fit well into a gut health model.
Right. Well, it's actually poisonous for the gut. Yeah. This is great. I have so many more questions, but we've been talking for a long time, friend. I hope to get to talk to you more. If I want more David Wiss, where do I find him?
Yeah, thank you.
I do.
Appreciate it. I'm on social media, Instagram and TikTok, Twitter at David A. Wiss. My practice website is nutritioninrecovery.com, and there are plenty of ways to get a hold of me there. I have a new blog that I started this year called Wise Mind Nutrition. And my nutrition and recovery practice has really been focused on addictions and eating disorders, and Wise Mind Nutrition is really moving into the space of anxiety, depression, and trauma. So I'm broadening into the larger domains of mental health as they relate to nutrition. And I've put out some really good blogs recently, just little 5-paragraph blurbs where you can learn something new. There's a ton of those on there, and I encourage people to sign up for the newsletter because I have a lot more content coming on wisemindnutrition.com.
Nice. Well, I love the Wise Mind as a DBT therapist. Well, I'm glad we're friends. I'm glad to have you on. I'm glad to know you. I have a lot more questions, so maybe we'll have you again. Thanks for existing. You're amazing.
You're amazing. Thank you so much.
Okay.